When you gotta do some dialogue, you gotta look it up, cause I'm a hog and I don't know how to rap at all, but I'm trying to make this intro interesting. Hello, and welcome to this month's installment of Let's Talk About Writing. Today we will be discussing delicious dialogue. I love dialogue. It's my absolute favorite part of books, both when I'm reading them and when I'm writing them. And I have a very strong feeling that a lot of people share my love of dialogue, so if you're out there and you love dialogue as much as I do, welcome. No, when I say that I love dialogue, I mean that legitimately. Dialogue is my favorite part of books, and there's a good reason why too. I'm not just a crazy dialogue fiend. Dialogue does so much, or at least if it's written well and it's done well, then it does so much. I'm going to talk about all of that in this, but first let's talk about what dialogue is. For those of you who do not know what dialogue is, or for those of you who would like your memory rekindled, the dictionary definition of dialogue is conversation between two or more people as a feature of a book, play, or movie. And for those of you who want an even simpler definition, it's everything that happens in these. They're called quotation marks. Some of you might think it's a little stupid of me to be going over what dialogue is and whatever, but you gotta start from the beginning. Have a solid platform, and I want to make sure that everybody has a solid platform, a solid understanding of what dialogue is before I get into the nitty-gritty of how to write it, why it's important, so on, so forth, and what have you. So now that you know what dialogue is, now I will kind of give you a general idea of, how you should write it and why, why it's important. Dialogue is a very, very important part of literature. I'm sure that you've read some books before where there was literally no dialogue, and it's really hard to make a book like that interesting. It's not impossible, it has been done, but just in general, as a general rule, it is somewhat difficult to make a book without dialogue interesting, because, dialogue does a lot for the story. It pushes things forward, it builds character dynamics and whatnot, and especially, if you have a book with one character, maybe it would work out fine, but if you have two or more characters and they're not talking to each other, then what's the point of having two or more characters? And it all depends on different things and different aspects of your book, but for the most part, in general, generally speaking, dialogue is very important. Writing dialogue is easy, or at least I think so. Some people disagree. Some people think that writing dialogue is the hardest part of a book, and they avoid it for that very reason, and they really keep the book within their characters' heads, which is all well and good, except then nothing's ever really happening. Like I said, dialogue really pushes the action forward, at least if it's done well. So if you're writing a book and it's all happening in this person's head and they're thinking about doing something but they're never actually doing it, that doesn't really work well. If they're thinking about telling this person off but they never do, then nothing ever actually happens. You just have a book that's like a catch-22 where you're always thinking that you're going to do something but then you never do it, and it's just, a cycle of nothing actually happening in your book. But in my personal opinion, dialogue isn't that difficult once you get used to it. Part of the trouble is making it sound realistic. That's what a lot of people have said to me before, oh, well, dialogue is all well and good, except, it's really hard to make it sound realistic. It's hard to make it sound like something that people would actually say, which I understand, and I completely agree. Back in the day when you first, especially when you first start, especially if you're young, it's really hard to make dialogue sound realistic because you don't have as much experience interacting with people as you do later in life and everything. Communication skills are something that you learn as you age. And writing dialogue is also somewhat different in that you have to make sure that it sounds realistic while not too realistic. If you insert likes and ums every 3 sentences like a normal person would say, when they're talking, then it becomes really drug out, and and if you have a conversation, because there's conversations that people have where they're talking but they're not really saying anything, You know what I mean? Like you're talking to somebody, you're going back and forth. Weather's nice. Oh yeah, did you see the game? Yeah, blah, blah, blah. If you include those types of conversations into your book, then things get muddled, things get boring, things get drug out. So it's a fine line between being too realistic and not realistic enough. So I have some helpful hints in order to help you write realistic dialogue. My first hint is to listen to people. Listen in on conversations and then write them. And what you should do when you listen to this conversation, you write it down, try to omit all of the like ums and the likes and the yeahs, anything that's really like not a central part of what they're saying. Copy it down and, use the correct punctuation and everything, put it in quotes, put he said, she said, all of that stuff, and you'll get a basic idea of, this is what people sound like. And obviously, if you want to write a certain character that would sound a certain way, find people in the world, find people that you know, try to draw from things that you know. That's a very important part of like writing in general, is drawing from what you know, because that makes things the most realistic. So if you have a bad boy character and you know of a bad boy in your school, pay attention to him, without stalking him. Pay attention to him, pay attention to how he acts. Because dialogue is not only about the spoken word, but also the gestures that go with it. That really brings out, like, how they're saying it is what they're doing while they're saying it. So if you got a bad boy character and you know a bad boy in your school, watch him. Does he lean against lockers when he talks? Does he have a certain, like, tilt to his head when he talks? And how does he talk? Does he have certain phrases that he says all the time? Does he have a certain dialect? Really listen to people and try to figure out how they talk and try to incorporate that into your own writing. Another thing that really helps when you're trying to write realistic dialogue is to read it aloud after you've written it. And use accents if your characters have accents. Like a few characters in my book have British accents, so I try and it's not a perfect accent. I am not going to say that I'm good at dialects and accents and everything, because I'm not. But it helps you to kind of picture the character saying it, and if something sounds off, then maybe you can go back and fix it, swap out a few words, swap out a few turns of phrase. Really just read it aloud, because it helps when you can hear it in your ear instead of your mind's ear. When you can hear it in your actual ear, it really helps you to kind of pick apart how it sounds, if it sounds realistic, if it sounds robotic, Hello, how are you? I'm fine, how are you? Very good. Have you seen the game today? No, I haven't, but that sounds robotic. But if it's like, hey, how are you doing? I'm fine, thanks, how are you? Oh, I'm pretty good. I was just doing this thing and whatever. Like, if you can say it out loud and it sounds really realistic, then it'll sound realistic when you're reading it. That's basically what I'm getting at. My third bit of advice for writing realistic dialogue is try not to make your characters all sound like you. That's one thing, is that, it's very, very easy when you're writing dialogue to think of what you would say and just put that on the page. But you've really got to think about the characters. Because when you're writing just based on yourself and how you yourself would talk, then every character ends up sounding the same, and you don't really have characters, you have yourself on the page. And of course the author's voice is so incredibly important. The way author writes everything it makes it unique and it makes it you, but you've got to try to make sure that you're not only taking from yourself. Because if it's just you talking to you, then there's nothing really interesting going on there. Unless, you're writing a clone scene or something and there's clones of the same person talking, then yeah, sure, we'll go with that. But if we're talking about just in general, just try not to make it sound too much like you, because that's a trapping I fell into. That's a trapping that a few of my friends I've read their writing and everything, they kind of fall into that too, is, writing and every single character sounds like them. But then in that case, they don't sound like the characters. You know what I mean? I think you understand kind of where I'm coming from, and if you don't, ask. And I'll try to specify better in the comments. So moving on from those kinds of hints and tips, then let's move into what dialogue should do for your story. Like I've said countless times already, dialogue should move the story forward. That's the whole point. If the dialogue isn't doing more than just being dialogue, then it's not worth it. You know, you could have the best scene in the, well, like, you could think that you have the best scene in the world where it's just like a bunch of funny banter back and forth, but if it's not establishing the characters, if it's not establishing the plot or moving the plot forward, if it's not doing more than just existing, then it's not worth having in your book. And I know that sucks, that sounds awful, that sounds like something where you're going to be like, oh, Layton, you're trying to, you know, censor my creative integrity, and no, I'm not. If you really want to keep that scene in, that's only dialogue and nothing else, go ahead. But from what I have learned in my classes that I've taken so far, and from what I've learned from, you know, a lot of research, I've done a lot of research about writing. I am a research fiend when it comes to learning how to write and, you know, different hints and tips and everything. From everything that I've learned, you know, agents and publishers aren't going to take you seriously if there's just this big scene that does nothing. You know, it can be great dialogue. I've even had to take out, I've had great moments, or at least I thought they were great, where it was my two characters and, you know, they were just spitting back and forth at each other and nothing was happening though. It was witticism after witticism after witticism, but they weren't doing anything with it. They were just bantering, and it didn't establish their characters at all. We already knew that their characters were witty. We already knew that they didn't like each other, so it didn't do anything in that regard. It just was. So I had to take it out, and I ended up replacing it with a better scene that was really established more of their backstories, that really, you know, it came to a climax instead of just existing and then, not with a bang, but with a whimper. And for some of you, this may seem obvious. You know, you may be like, well, of course your dialogue has to do more than, like, one thing, you know. Of course it has to establish character and everything, but it's easy. It's easy, especially when you're first starting out, to write dialogue and think that it's great, but it actually doesn't do anything for the story. It's easy to fall into that trapping. I've done it. You've probably done it, whether you want to admit it or not. We've all done it. Another thing about dialogue, and this kind of goes into each character having their own unique voice too, is you should kind of be able to tell who's talking, who's saying what, without having to use he said, she said after every line of dialogue. I had a teacher, and she said that, you know, it makes your book sound really elementary when you say, he said, she said, he exhaled, she sighed, he... I don't know. I've run out of adjectives. But you know what I mean? They're called dialogue tags. That's what those are called. And if you have too many dialogue tags, then it makes your book sound very elementary. It makes it sound very middle grade. And if you're writing middle grade, then great, keep them. And of course there's other times where it's very short things, like you said yes, but you and they. You know, if it's things like that that really have no tells, then obviously you're going to have to put it in, especially if there's more than one character talking at once. And I read this book once where it was two people talking, but for some reason even it wasn't like when you have two people talking back and forth and you're not using dialogue tags, and it should be character 1, character 2, character 1, character 2, character 1, character 2, character 1, character 2, with no dialogue tags. But I read one where it was like character 1, character 2, character 1, character 2, character 1, character 1, character 2, character 1, character 2, and it got really confusing, and I was like, wait, who said that? Who said that? Where? Why? So you have to know when and where to use dialogue tags. And another good way to get away from dialogue tags while still establishing who's talking, you know, if it's a line that wouldn't really give away who's saying something, is giving an action instead, you know, showing, not telling. So instead of saying, I don't know what to tell you, she sighed, have it be like, she sighed, I don't know what to tell you. So then, you see what I mean? So then you kind of establish who's saying it, and then you have the dialogue. Or the other way you could do it is, I don't know what to tell you, period, quotation, capital S. She sighed, sitting down at her desk and putting her head on the surface, or whatever. That really gets it away from sounding middle grade, very elementary, too. It really makes it seem fuller. You're getting action and gesture in there with the dialogue. That really helps the book seem more interesting. Because I don't know about you, but I personally, when I read a book and every single line is tagged with he said, she said, it gets annoying after a while, because, you know, it's almost like the author isn't giving you enough credit as the reader to be able to figure these things out. It's like they're discrediting your intelligence or questioning your intelligence, and you don't want to do that. As an author, you do not want to discredit the reader's intelligence. If you think that it's pretty self-explanatory, then it probably is. So before we end this video, I want to talk a little bit more about how dialogue can help you establish things, because you know how I said it can help you establish character relations or plot or move the plot forward or whatever, but I didn't really go into that. So just really quickly, I want to talk about how you can do that, how it can really build on character relationships. You can have them learn things about each other that really changes their perception of that character. And that can be in a negative or a positive way, you know. You could find out that the other character is racist, or you could find out that the other character saves puppies in their spare time. You know, there's a million different ways that you can go about that. And that's something, you know, you don't always have to find out through gesture or through action. You know, they don't have to literally be saving a puppy right at that second to learn about it. You know, you could say, oh yeah, you know, I once dove into a river and saved a puppy from drowning. You know, there's a million ways that you can do that, and you've just really got to think about how that works best for you and for your story. As far as moving the action along, or the plot along, I have one of my characters, when they're talking about how they both have feelings for this girl, and they're discussing this, and then they talk about, they somehow get into the conversation about riding a bike, and my one character says, oh well, you know, I don't know how to ride a bike, and my main character, my protagonist, is like, how do you not know how to ride a bike? Did your dad, like, not teach you? And the other character is like, well, you know, he's not really that kind of a dad. So you learn about him and his family life, and then my protagonist says, well, what about your mom? And the other character says, oh, well, she's dead. So then there we have learning things about the characters, but it also moves the plot along, because that really plays into a lot of things later. His mom being dead, that moves the plot along. So you see, it kind of does double duty, as well as it being dialogue. Dialogue also is really cool where it moves the story along a lot quicker. Dialogue is that thing where you don't have to spend 2 paragraphs trying to figure something out. It can happen in an instant. You can figure it out in an instant. It moves the story along. And like I took a young adult fiction writing class, and that was the one thing that my teacher was always praising me on, was good dialogue that moves the story forward. That's what it does. It moves the story forward, and it moves it forward quickly. And because readers don't want to be sitting there trudging through a book. If you've ever read classic literature, you know, there's a lot of classic literature that's just a lot of trudgery, and, you know, it just takes forever to get through it all because there's so much description. And dialogue is just zip, zap, zap, zip, 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 and it just feels so fulfilling. And if you are able to incorporate it with the description well enough, then it just flows very smoothly. And as I've said before, I love flowy, smooth writing, and I think that most people do enjoy flowy, smooth writing. So I hope that this Let's Talk About Writing was very helpful to you, whether you're just starting out writing or whether you're, you know, just somebody who's written for a long time but is kind of struggling with dialogue. Hopefully this helped. If you'd like me to elaborate on anything, just ask me in the comments. I'll elaborate. If you have anything that you think that I didn't talk about at all that you'd like me to talk about, mention in the comments and I will talk about it there. You know, if you'd like a part 2 about this, if there's enough things that people say, well, what about this, what about this, what about this, maybe I'll make a part 2 to this, because there's certain things, you know, there's certain ones that I've done already that, certain Let's Talk About Writings that, you know, could be wrapped up in one, but I feel like certain things like dialogue, imagery, all of the stuff that I'm going to be talking about in later videos, some of it could possibly expand into a second video if enough people have enough questions. So if you have any questions, mention them in the comments below and I will get to them. I'll try to explain them. I might make a part 2 if there's enough. And overall, I hope that this video was helpful. I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, leave a like, because it's nice to know that people enjoy my videos. Good motivation and whatnot, as I've said before. And yeah, I hope that you have a very beautiful day. I hope that you write beautiful dialogue, delicious dialogue, and I will see you next time. Bye!